Hi, I'm Paul Peterson.
I'm Chris Sun Liu. This is part 4 of the Constitution lecture, Assessing the Constitution. In the ratification campaign, who made the case for the Constitution?
Well, the case for the Constitution, Chris, was made by three people, the authors of the Federalist Papers. Of course, other people made the case as well, but this is what's come down in history as the definitive argument for the Constitution. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay each drafted some of these papers, and they've been collected together under the title The Federalist Papers. Now, they appeared originally in the heat of the battle, in the middle of the campaign, in the state of New York, the very state where the outcome of the ratification campaign was most in doubt. The ratification was by 30 votes to 27 votes, and many people say that we wouldn't have had a constitution had we not had the Federalist Papers making such a powerful case for the Constitution in this document.
What was the core argument of the Federalist Papers?
Well, the Federalist Papers takes up many, many issues, and we have asked you to read some of these papers. But some of the key decisions or key arguments made in the Federalist Papers was they made a virtue of the fact that they had made a lot of compromises. They said, it's a good thing we have a House and a Senate. It's a good thing that some of the powers are exercised by the national government and some by the state governments. It's a good thing that we have power divided between the president and the Congress. So we have a government of checks and balances, sharing power between the president, the Congress, the courts, between state and local governments, and even within states we have power divided between governors, state legislatures, and state courts. So we have a very complicated system, one that balances out one power center against the other. Now, maybe it is the case that this government is so convoluted, so complex, we can't get anything done. There's always a lot of frustration, and we see that in the United States today, that the frustration with the constitutional power system leads many people to say we should do it differently. But there are many virtues of it. It protects the rights of minorities, and everybody has some part of that political system that they can control. And it's been one of the ways in which we have found consensus, a way of reaching compromises that reenact those great compromises that were decided early on at the Constitutional Convention.
According to the Federalist Papers, what exactly does this system of checks and balances do?
Well, in Madison's essay, Federalist 10, he makes the case that checks and balances preserve liberty. He says there are two threats to liberty. There's the threat from overseas. The British could come back. The French could show up. The Spanish could show up. We have to have a strong government to protect the liberties of the American people from potential invasion from abroad. Remember that the Spanish are down there in Florida, and the French are in Louisiana and the West, and the English are in Canada. So all of those threats to liberty are there from overseas, but there's also a threat from within. There's a threat that somebody will grab power and tyrannize the rest. And the greatest threat from within is the tyranny of the majority, because the majority can impose their will on the minority. But checks and balances divide majorities up so that it's really difficult to get an overwhelming majority that can control the presidency, can control the courts, can control the Senate, and control the House of Representatives. And that protects minorities, and that protects liberty. So says Madison in Federalist 10.
The Federalists made the case for the Constitution. Who made the case against it?
Well, they were called the Anti-Federalists, and Patrick Henry was an outstanding anti-federalist. He had said previously, "Give me liberty or give me death," and he said, well, the Constitution is going to take away the liberties that we had won at the Revolution. He wanted to keep power in the hands of the states. He feared a national government. And some people say that Thomas Jefferson was helping out Patrick Henry from behind the scenes, even though he was at the time in Paris as the ambassador from the United to the French. So the Anti-Federalists made a powerful case that was a lot like the small state case, that we don't want a powerful national government.
What would you say was the biggest mistake made by the delegates at the Constitutional Convention?
Well, that was the mistake that the Anti-Federalists focused on, which was there was no Bill of Rights in the Constitution. There was a lot of talk about who had power, whether it was the president or the Congress or the big states or the small states, but there was never any statement that said we're going to protect the rights of the American people. Well, this actually came up at the Constitutional Convention. It's not like they didn't consider this, but it was brought up by people who later on would become anti-federalists, and already even at the Constitutional Convention themselves, these people were treated as a small minority that could just be ignored. So they didn't really pay attention to the argument. The Federalists said, you know, a Bill of Rights has no meaning. These are just parchment barriers. These are just words on paper. You promise people rights, but unless you have mechanisms, unless you break power into pieces, you have no way of enforcing these statements of this group has a right or that group has a right. But nonetheless, in the course of the ratification campaign, it became very clear that you had to do something about this problem. So the Federalist Papers addressed this issue, and they promised that the Bill of Rights will be enacted into law through amendments to the Constitution at the very first meeting of the new Congress under the Constitution. So the Federalists promised a Bill of Rights. It's not in the Constitution, but it's promised at the time of the ratification campaign.
Now, did the Federalists actually keep this promise and follow through?
Well, you know, when people make promises, you often wonder, especially if they're politicians, if they're really going to keep their promises. And in this case, a lot of Federalists began ducking and weaving once they got their Constitution approved. And it was almost the case that we did not get a Bill of Rights after all. But there was one person, James Madison, who later on becomes president. He was a very short man. This is his statue in Rapid City, South Dakota. And this young girl is just as tall as James Madison. He looked pretty short next to George Washington. He was a neighbor of George Washington. He really had been an advocate of the big states, but he came from Virginia, where Patrick Henry came from. And the Bill of Rights was such a hot issue in the state of Virginia that if he was going to get elected to the House of Representatives, which he wanted to be elected to, he was going to have to show that he was a strong advocate of the Bill of Rights. So actually, James Madison sits down and pretty much writes the Bill of Rights himself. He actually had to compromise and work it out with others, but he is, more than anyone else, the author of our Bill of Rights.
What were some of the key protections contained in the Bill of Rights?
Well, we're going to talk about that a lot in the course, but just to run over them, to put some flesh on those bones, freedom of speech, free exercise of religion, right to bear arms, guard against unreasonable searches and seizures, trial by jury, can't be denied life, liberty, or property without due process of law, can't be forced to testify against oneself, no cruel or unusual punishment. All of these things are in the Bill of Rights. Other things are as well. And we'll go into this in more detail in the course of the semester.
One of the objections that people often raise today about the Constitution is how it dealt with slavery. How did the Constitution address this thorny issue of slavery?
Well, you would have thought that maybe these great leaders would have said, let's bring slavery to an end. But when you realize that you had to have a constitution that could be ratified in every state, you couldn't bring slavery to an end through the Constitution. However, they did stop the importation of slaves in 1808 from abroad, though they left the internal slave market. They decided that a slave could be counted as 3/5 of a person. The Southerners wanted to count a slave as a full person, despite the fact that this person didn't exist except as a piece of property otherwise. The Northerners said they shouldn't be counted at all if they couldn't vote, couldn't be considered a citizen. So they compromised on 3/5. A slave is 3/5 of a person. Well, all of that can be justified only in one way, and that's to say the Constitution was written to win an election.
Any final remarks on the Constitution, Professor Peterson?
Well, you can criticize it. It's really easy to do. The slavery question is one. The vague and ambiguous language is another. But you have to agree that if they hadn't done all of these things, there would be no Constitution. But because the language was vague, it made it possible to introduce change over time. And the role of judicial review and the role of the courts in interpreting the Constitution and allowing for changes in the Constitution is one of the great strengths of the document. But it should also be said that the political framework was put into place that created a continental empire. As the country grew in size, it admitted new states to the Union that were treated as identical to the old states. And so you didn't have a colonial empire, you had a democratic empire. And you had trade among the states, which created a national market, and that proved to be an incredibly powerful force that made the United States, by the end of the 19th century, the world's dominant economic power, despite the fact that it had 100 years earlier been a small country gathered on the eastern coast with dubious prospects, likely to be conquered by one of those European powers once again. So the Constitution has to be recognized as one of the greatest political accomplishments of the modern era.
In the next lecture, we'll talk about the principle of judicial review.